Grace Hartford stood in that hospital hallway, blood on her hands, cradling a baby while police surrounded her. "Ma'am, step away from the infant." But here's what they didn't know: that baby was hers, stolen from her the night she gave birth, by her own sister. This is the true story of how a millionaire and his mistress conspired to erase a pregnant wife from existence, how they stole her money, her identity, and her newborn twins, how the entire system believed their lies, and how one mother fought back against impossible odds to reclaim everything they took. What happened next will shock you. But first, if stories of survival and justice matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe. You'll want to hear every second of this, because Grace Hartford's nightmare was just beginning. The flash of cameras felt like gunfire. Grace Hartford stood frozen in the doorway of the Beacon Grand Ballroom, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other gripping her clutch so tightly her knuckles had gone white. 6 months pregnant and wearing her favorite navy dress, she had arrived at her husband's company anniversary gala, expecting to celebrate beside him. Instead, she was staring at the stage where Blake Hartford, her husband of 4 years, stood with his arm wrapped around another woman, a woman in a crimson dress, a woman Grace knew better than anyone, her sister. "That's Vivian," Grace whispered to no one in particular. The words tasted like poison. A colleague from Blake's company, a junior analyst named Rachel Montgomery, touched Grace's elbow gently. "I'm so sorry," Rachel said. "I thought you should see it yourself. I tried to warn you." Grace's mind spun backward through the last few weeks. Blake's late nights, his distance. The way he flinched when she tried to hold his hand, she had blamed it on stress, on the pressure of running Hartford Technologies. She had blamed herself for being too tired, too emotional, too pregnant. She had never blamed Vivian. On stage, Blake tapped the microphone. The room fell silent. 200 people in designer suits and glittering jewelry turned their attention to the handsome CEO with his perfect smile and his perfect companion. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Blake said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "This company has grown beyond my wildest dreams, and I owe it to every single person in this room. But tonight, I want to share something personal." Grace's heart began to pound. She wanted to run, but her feet felt cemented to the marble floor. Blake turned to Vivian, and the way he looked at her, the tenderness in his eyes, it was the way he used to look at Grace. "This woman has shown me what it means to truly live, what it means to be honest about what you want. Vivian has changed my life, and I want everyone here to know that we're building a future together." The room erupted in confused murmurs. Heads turned, searching for Grace Hartford, the wife everyone knew was pregnant with Blake's child. Grace felt the walls closing in. The chandelier lights seemed too bright, the music too loud, the air too thin. She took one step backward, then another, but Rachel caught her in arm. "Grace, don't leave. You have every right to be here." But Grace wasn't listening anymore, because Vivian had turned toward the crowd, and their eyes met across the ballroom. For just a moment, Grace saw something flicker across her sister's face. Guilt, maybe, or triumph. Then Vivian smiled and leaned up to kiss Blake's cheek. The cameras flashed again. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Grace recognized several entertainment journalists who covered Boston's elite social scene. This wasn't just a company event anymore. This was a scandal, and she was at the center of it. "Mrs. Hartford," a reporter shoved a microphone toward her. "Did you know about your husband's relationship with your sister? How do you feel about this announcement? Are you still living together?" Grace stumbled backward, and that's when she felt it. A warm rush of liquid down her legs, her water breaking. "No," she gasped. "No, no, no, it's too early." The pain hit her like a freight train, sharp and overwhelming. She doubled over, crying out, and the reporters swarmed closer. More cameras, more flashing lights, more voices shouting questions she couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. Rachel screamed for help. Someone called 911. Through the chaos, Grace looked up one more time at the stage. Blake had gone pale. He stood frozen, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Shock, maybe. Or was it annoyance that she had ruined his perfect moment? Vivian's hand tightened on Blake's arm, and she whispered something in his ear. He nodded slowly, then turned away from Grace. Back to the microphone. Please, Blake said to the crowd, his voice steady again. Let's give her some space. Someone call an ambulance. But he didn't come to her. He didn't rush down from that stage to hold her hand or tell her everything would be okay. He just stood there, with Vivian at his side, while Grace Hartford collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The last thing she remembered before the darkness took her was the sound of Vivian's laugh, light and musical, cutting through the chaos like a knife. Then the world went black, and Grace wondered if this was what it felt like to lose everything all at once. The ambulance sirens wailed in the distance. Growing closer, someone covered her with a jacket. Strong hands lifted her onto a stretcher. And as they wheeled her out of the Beacon Grand Ballroom, past the staring faces and the clicking cameras, Grace Hartford realized with absolute clarity that her life as she knew it was over. The man she loved had chosen her sister, and her baby was coming far too soon. The emergency room at Boston General was a blur of white coats and urgent voices. Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, caught between the sharp reality of contractions and the merciful fog of medication. Someone had called her name. A doctor, tall with graying hair and kind eyes, leaned over her. Mrs. Hartford, I'm Dr. Owen Priest. You're at 28 weeks. We need to stop this labor if we can, but we need your consent to proceed. Grace tried to focus on his face. My baby. Save my baby. We're going to do everything we can. I need you to stay calm and breathe with me. But she couldn't stay calm because the doors burst open and Blake Hartford strode in, followed by a man in an expensive suit carrying a leather briefcase. Blake. Grace reached out her hand, hope and relief flooding through the pain. He had come. Of course he had come. Whatever was happening with Vivian, whatever madness had taken over tonight, he was still her husband. He would be here for the birth of their child. Blake didn't take her hand. He stood at the foot of the bed, his expression cold and distant. The man with the briefcase stepped forward. Mrs. Hartford, I'm Richard Sullivan, Mr. Hartford's attorney. We need you to sign these papers. Dr. Priest moved between them and the bed. Gentlemen, this woman is in active labor. This is not the time. She's lucid, Blake said flatly. She can sign. Grace's vision swam with tears. Blake, what are you doing? I'm doing what I should have done months ago. He nodded to the attorney, who opened the briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. These are divorce papers. Grace, I'll make sure you're taken care of financially, but I need you to sign them tonight. Tonight, Grace's voice cracked. I'm having your baby right now. Blake's jaw tightened. Vivian is pregnant too. We're getting married next month. I'm sorry, Grace, but this is how it has to be. The words hit harder than any physical pain. Vivian was pregnant. Blake was leaving her for Vivian, and Vivian was carrying his child too. Get out, Dr. Priest said, his voice like steel. Get out of my emergency room right now, or I will have security remove you. The attorney started to protest, but Blake held up his hand. He looked at Grace one more time, and she searched his face for any trace of the man she had married. The man who had proposed to her on a beach in Maine, who had promised to love her forever, who had held her hand when they first saw their baby's heartbeat on the ultrasound screen. That man was gone. Sign the papers. Grace, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Then he turned and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the sterile hospital corridor, and Grace Hartford began to scream, not from the contractions, though they were tearing her apart, but from the agony of watching her entire world shatter. Dr. Priest shouted orders. Nurses rushed around her. Someone adjusted her IV, and the world began to soften at the edges. We need to do an emergency cesarean, Dr. Priest said gently, his face close to hers. Your blood pressure is dangerously high. I'm going to save your baby. Grace, I promise you that. He left me, Grace whispered. He just left me. I know. Dr. Priest squeezed her hand, and the kindness in his eyes made her sob harder. But you're not alone. I'm right here. They wheeled her into surgery. The lights overhead were too bright. Someone placed a mask over her face, and a calm voice told her to count backward from 10. 10, 9, 8. Grace thought about Vivian, about the way she had smiled on that stage. 7, 6, 5. She thought about Blake's cold eyes, the way he had looked at her like she was a stranger. 4, 3, 2. She thought about her baby. Her tiny baby who was fighting to survive. 1. Then darkness swallowed her whole. When Grace woke up, the clock on the wall said it was 3 in the morning. 3 days had passed, though she didn't know that yet. Her body felt hollowed out, aching and strange. She tried to sit up and gasped at the pain. A nurse appeared immediately, a young woman named Casey Vaughn with gentle hands and a worried expression. "Easy, Mrs. Hartford. You've been through quite an ordeal." "My baby." Grace's voice was hoarse. "Where's my baby?" Casey smiled, and it was genuine. "He's in the NICU, a little boy, 3 pounds 2 ounces. He's a fighter." Relief made Grace dizzy. "Can I see him?" "Soon, Dr. Priest wants to check on you first. You lost a lot of blood during the surgery." Casey adjusted the IV line. "Mrs. Hartford, there's something you should know. Your husband hasn't been here." The words shouldn't have hurt anymore, but they did. "I know. But his lawyers have—" Casey's voice dropped to a whisper. "They've been here twice. They took photographs of your medical charts. They spoke with the hospital administrator. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but something didn't feel right about it." Grace's heart began to pound. "What do you mean?" "I don't know exactly, but I think you should be careful. Get a lawyer of your own. Don't sign anything else." Before Grace could respond, the door opened and Dr. Priest entered, his expression serious. "Grace, how are you feeling?" "Confused, tired, scared." She looked at him. "Can I see my son?" "Soon, I promise, but first, there's something we need to discuss." He pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Your medical records have been flagged by the hospital's legal department. Blake's attorneys have requested copies, and they're claiming you were under the influence of drugs during your pregnancy." "That's insane. I would never." "I know that. I was your doctor through this entire emergency. But Grace, someone has falsified your toxicology reports. According to the official records, you tested positive for cocaine and prescription opioids." The room tilted. "That's impossible." "I know it is. I ran the test myself. They were clean, but someone changed them in the system." Grace felt the walls closing in again. Blake. Blake had done this, or his lawyers had. They were trying to make her look unfit so they could take her baby. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would he do this to me?" Dr. Priest's expression was grim. "I don't know, but I've been a doctor for 20 years, and I've seen this before. Powerful people rewriting narratives to get what they want. The question is, what does Blake want?" Grace closed her eyes. She already knew the answer. He wanted her erased. He wanted to start fresh with Vivian, with their new baby, with a life that didn't include the inconvenient wife who had loved him, and he was willing to destroy her to make it happen. Grace was released from the hospital 5 days after giving birth. Baby Noah remained in the NICU, hooked up to machines that monitored his tiny heartbeat, his fragile breathing. He was stable, the doctor said, but he would need to stay for several more weeks. Grace visited him every day, sitting beside his incubator for hours, singing softly and pressing her hand against the warm plastic that separated them. She had never felt love like this before, fierce and protective and absolutely terrifying. On the 6th day, she returned to the penthouse apartment she had shared with Blake, hoping against hope that maybe he had changed his mind, that maybe this nightmare had been some terrible mistake. The locks had been changed. Grace stood in the hallway, her hospital bag in one hand, her keys useless in the other. A notice had been taped to the door. Eviction notice. By order of the property owner, Blake Hartford. She was no longer permitted on the premises. Her belongings had been packed and could be collected from the building's storage facility. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process how quickly her life had been dismantled. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Mrs. Hartford, this is Elizabeth Warren from Hartford Technologies Legal Department. Your credit cards have been suspended pending the divorce proceedings. Please contact our office to arrange temporary support." Grace tried her debit card at the ATM in the lobby. Declined. She tried her credit card. Declined. She logged into her bank account and found it empty. Every penny she had saved, every cent from her trust fund, gone. Blake had frozen her out completely. She ended up at a cheap motel near the hospital, paying with the only cash she had left in her wallet, $243. Enough for a few nights, maybe a week if she was careful. The room smelled like cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner. The bed was lumpy, the walls paper thin. Grace sat on the edge of the mattress and finally let herself fall apart. She cried until her throat was raw, until her chest ached, until there were no tears left. Then she pulled out her phone and opened Instagram. Vivian had posted a photo 2 hours ago. It showed her and Blake at a doctor's office. Vivian's hand resting on her flat stomach, both of them glowing with happiness. The caption read, 12 weeks with our miracle baby. Feeling so blessed and grateful for this new chapter with the love of my life. The comments were full of heart emojis and congratulations. Nobody mentioned Grace. It was like she had never existed. Grace scrolled through the responses and felt something inside her begin to harden. Not break, not shatter, but solidify into something cold and sharp. They had humiliated her, stolen from her, lied about her, tried to take her child, but she was still standing, and she was going to fight back. The next morning, Grace received a call from a woman named Diane Fletcher. Mrs. Hartford, you don't know me, but I'm an investigative journalist with the Boston Globe. I'd like to talk to you about your husband. Grace almost hung up. The last thing she needed was more reporters, more cameras, more public humiliation. But something in the woman's voice made her pause. What should? Grace asked carefully. Because 3 years ago, Blake Hartford destroyed my career. I published a story about insider trading at Hartford Technologies, and he buried me in lawsuits. He called me a liar. He got me fired. He made sure I would never work for a major publication again. Grace's pulse quickened. You're saying Blake is a criminal. I'm saying Blake is very good at making things disappear. Stories, evidence, people. Diane paused. I've been building a case against him for years. I have evidence of financial fraud, of shell companies, of money laundering, but I need someone on the inside, someone who knows where the bodies are buried. I don't know anything about his business, but you know him. You lived with him. You have access to his life in ways I never could. Diane's voice softened. I saw what happened at the gala. Mrs. Hartford, I saw the tabloid stories calling you unstable. I know what he's doing to you, and I want to help you take him down. Grace looked around the dingy motel room, at the peeling wallpaper and the stained carpet and the life she never imagined she would be living. What do you need me to do? She asked. Meet me today. I'll show you what I have, and you can decide if you want to be part of this. They met at a coffee shop in Cambridge, far from the Boston social circles where Grace might be recognized. Diane was in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and intense, with a laptop bag full of files and flash drives. She spread the evidence across the table like a general planning an attack. Financial statements, email printouts, photographs of Blake meeting with suspicious characters, bank records showing millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts. This is just the surface, Diane said. Hartford Technologies has been cooking the books for years. Blake has been inflating stock prices, lying to investors, siphoning money into private accounts. He's built an empire on fraud. Grace stared at these papers. Why hasn't anyone caught him? Because he's careful, and because he has people in his pocket, accountants, lawyers, even a few judges. Diane pulled out another file. But here's the interesting part. About 6 months ago, someone new started accessing these offshore accounts. Someone who forged authorization documents to transfer funds. She slid a bank statement across the table. Grace's signature was at the bottom, except Grace had never seen the document before. That's not my signature, Grace said. I know. It's a forgery, but it's a good one. Diane leaned forward. Mrs. Hartford, someone has been systematically draining your trust fund. $39 million transferred out over the last 6 months. And according to these documents, you authorized every single transaction. Grace felt sick. Vivian, your sister has been stealing from you. And I think Blake knows. I think they've been planning this together. The pieces fell into place. Blake's distance over the last few months, Vivian's sudden involvement in his life, the divorce papers, the custody threats, the false medical records. They hadn't just fallen in love, they had conspired to destroy her. What can I do? Grace asked, her voice shaking. Diane smiled, and it was sharp. We can expose them, all of it. The fraud, the theft, the lies. But it's going to take time, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. How much worse? Blake is filing for emergency custody of your son. He's claiming you're an unfit mother. The hearing is in 3 days. Grace's world tilted again. He can't do that. Noah is mine. He can, and he will, unless we move fast. Diane closed her laptop. I need you to trust me. Mrs. Hartford, can you do that? Grace thought about Noah, tiny and fragile in his NICU incubator. She thought about Blake and Vivian, building their perfect life on the ruins of hers. She thought about the woman she used to be, trusting and naive and kind. That woman was gone. Yes, Grace said. I trust you. Let's burn them down. The courthouse was cold and impersonal, all polished wood and fluorescent lighting. Grace sat beside her court-appointed attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Margaret Foster, who had met her exactly once before this hearing, across the aisle. Blake was flanked by a team of 3 lawyers in expensive suits. He looked calm, confident, every inch the successful CEO. He didn't even glance in Grace's direction. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Winters, reviewed the files before her with a frown. This is highly irregular, Judge Winters said. Emergency custody hearings are reserved for cases of immediate danger to the child. Blake's lead attorney stood. Your Honor, Mrs. Hartford has demonstrated a pattern of erratic and dangerous behavior. She has a documented history of substance abuse. She's currently homeless, living in a motel, unable to provide stable housing for an infant. And most concerning, she violated hospital protocol multiple times, putting her newborn son at risk. That's a lie. Grace started to stand, but Margaret Foster pulled her back down. Let me handle this, Foster whispered, but she didn't handle it well. Foster was overworked and underprepared, and Blake's legal team steamrolled over every objection she raised. They presented the falsified medical records. They called a hospital administrator who testified that Grace had been difficult and combative with staff. They even produced a psychiatrist who had never met Grace but was willing to say she displayed signs of postpartum psychosis. It was a massacre. When it was Grace's turn to testify, she walked to the stand on shaking legs. Blake's attorney, Richard Sullivan, circled her like a shark. Mrs. Hartford, is it true you had no idea your husband was unhappy in your marriage? That's not fair. He never told me. Answer the question, please, yes or no. I didn't know he wanted a divorce. No. Would you say you're observant, attentive to the people around you? Yes, I try to be. Yet you failed to notice your own husband having an affair with your sister for months. Sullivan's smile was cruel. How can we trust you to notice if your infant son is in distress? Grace's hands clenched in her lap. I love my son. I would never let anything happen to him. Love isn't enough. Mr. Hartford, children need stability, security. Can you provide that right now? I'm working on it. I just need time. Time you don't have. Your son is in the NICU fighting for his life, and you're living in a motel room, unemployed with no family support. Sullivan turned to the judge. Your Honor, Mr. Hartford is prepared to provide the best care possible for his son. He has the resources, the stability, and most importantly, the judgment that Mrs. Hartford clearly lacks. Grace wanted to scream that Blake had orchestrated all of this, that he had stolen her money, frozen her accounts, locked her out of her home, that he had created the very circumstances he was now using against her. But she had no proof. Not yet. Judge Winters deliberated for less than 10 minutes. I'm granting temporary custody to Mr. Hartford, she said, and Grace's world ended again. Mrs. Hartford will be permitted the supervised visitation twice weekly, pending a full psychological evaluation. We'll reconvene in 60 days. Grace couldn't hear anything over the ringing in her ears. Margaret Foster was saying something, but the words didn't penetrate. Blake was shaking hands with his lawyers, accepting their congratulations. And then Vivian has walked in. She had been waiting outside the courtroom, and now she entered with perfect timing, going straight to Blake's side. She wore a cream-colored dress that somehow made her look angelic, innocent. She placed her hand on Blake's arm, and he covered it with his own. They were a picture of unity, of love, of everything Grace had lost. Vivian's eyes found Grace across the courtroom, and for just a second, her mask slipped. Grace saw the triumph there, the satisfaction. This was what Vivian had wanted all along. Not just Blake, but Grace's complete destruction. Outside the courthouse, Diane Fletcher was waiting by her car. "I heard," she said simply. "I'm sorry." Grace couldn't cry anymore. She had run out of tears. "What do I do now?" "Now we accelerate the plan." Diane opened her car door. "Get in. There's someone you need to meet." They drove to a small office in Brookline, where a forensic accountant named Thomas Barrett was waiting. He was in his late 40s, anxious-looking, with dark circles under his eyes. "Mr. Barrett has been Blake's business partner for 8 years," Diane explained. "He's also been embezzling money from Hartford Technologies." And Vivian found out. Thomas Barrett looked at Grace with something like shame. "She's been blackmailing me for 6 months, threatening to expose me if I didn't help her. I didn't want to do it, but she said she'd destroy me." "Help her do what?" Grace asked. "The DNA samples. At the hospital, she told me to switch them." Grace's breath caught. "What DNA samples?" "The paternity tests, the ones the court ordered. She gave me a sample from some random man, told me to make sure it replaced Blake's sample for the test." "Why would she do that?" Thomas looked at her like she was missing something obvious. "Because Blake isn't the father of her baby, Mrs. Hartford. Vivian was never pregnant." The world stopped spinning. "What did you just say?" "Vivian faked her pregnancy. The ultrasound she posted on Instagram, she stole it from a pregnancy forum online. She's been wearing fake belly prosthetics. She's planning to steal a baby and pass it off as hers and Blake's." Diane was recording everything on her phone. "Blake, whose baby is she planning to steal?" "Mr. Barrett." He wouldn't meet Grace's eyes. "Yours." Grace couldn't process what she was hearing. Vivian was going to steal Noah. How went, but Thomas Barrett wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Mrs. Hartford, do you remember the night you gave birth?" "The emergency cesarean." "Barely. I was unconscious for most of it. Dr. Priest delivered your baby. But you didn't have one baby. You had 2. The room went silent. "That's impossible," Grace said. "I would have known. The ultrasounds showed one baby, but sometimes twins hide behind each other, especially early in pregnancy. It's rare, but it happens." Thomas pulled out a file. "These are your surgical notes, the original ones before they were altered. Dr. Priest delivered twin boys. One weighed 3 pounds, 2 ounces. The other weighed 2 pounds, 9 ounces. Grace felt like she was falling. "Where's my other baby?" "Vivian took him. The same night you gave birth, while you were still sedated. She dressed as a nurse, went into the NICU, and wheeled him out. The hospital security footage shows everything." Diane was already pulling up the video on her laptop. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. A woman in scrubs, face partially obscured by a surgical mask, entering the NICU at 2:37 a.m. She moved with purpose, checking the labels on 2 incubators before selecting one. She picked up the infant inside, wrapped him in a pink blanket, and walked out. The timestamp read 3:15 a.m., the same night Grace gave birth. "She stole my son," Grace whispered. The words felt surreal. "She's been raising my baby for 3 weeks, and I didn't even know he existed." "She filed a birth certificate 2 weeks ago," Thomas said. "Claims she gave birth at a private birthing center. Named the baby Alexander Blake Hartford. She's been posting photos of him online, pretending he's hers." Grace's hands started shaking. Then her whole body, she thought she might vomit. Why, she finally managed. "Why would she do this?" "Because she's sick," Diane said bluntly. "I did some digging into Vivian's past. Did you know she was institutionalized when she was 16? "What? No, she told me she went to boarding school in Connecticut." "That was a lie. She was at a psychiatric facility in Vermont for 14 months. She was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and something called identity disturbance. She became obsessed with her roommate, tried to steal her identity. She dyed her hair the same color, forged documents, even tried to seduce her roommate's boyfriend. Grace felt sick. I didn't know any of this. Your parents covered it up, paid the facility to seal the records, sent Vivian to therapy for years. But clearly it didn't work. Diane closed her laptop. Grace, your sister doesn't just want Blake or your money or your baby. She wants to be you. She wants your entire life. Everything made a horrible kind of sense now. The way Vivian had always copied Grace's style, her interests, her choices, the way she'd hung on Grace's every word at family dinners, studying her, learning her. Grace had thought it was admiration. It had been preparation. We have to get my baby back, Grace said. Both of them, right now. We will, Diane promised. But we have to be smart about this. If we go to the police right now, Blake's lawyers will bury this evidence. They'll claim the security footage is fake, that Thomas is lying, that you're a desperate mother making accusations. So what do, Boyle? We let them think they've won. We wait until the DNA test results come back, and then we prove that Vivian's baby is actually yours. Grace wanted to argue, wanted to storm Blake's penthouse and take her children back by force. But she knew Diane was right. They had to build an airtight case. How long? Grace asked. The DNA results will be back in 48 hours. Blake ordered them because his investors are demanding proof of paternity for company succession reasons. Ironic, isn't it? The test that was supposed to legitimize his new family is going to destroy them. Grace looked at Thomas Barrett. Why are you helping us now? What changed? He met her eyes for the first time. Because I have a daughter. She's 7. And if someone did to her what Vivian is doing to you, I'd want someone to help her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hartford. I'm sorry for all of it. Grace should have hated him. He had enabled Vivian, helped steal her child, switched the DNA samples. But looking at his anguished face, she saw something she recognized. A victim. Someone else Vivian had manipulated and used. Help us make this right, Grace said. Help us stop her. I will. I've been recording everything. Every conversation with Vivian, every instruction she gave me, every threat she made. It's all on here. He handed Diane a small flash drive. This should be enough to bury them both. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She lay in her motel room, staring at the water-stained ceiling, thinking about her sons. Noah, who she held every day, and the other one, the twin she hadn't known existed, who was being raised by the woman who had stolen everything from her. She thought about names. Noah needed a brother's name, something strong, something that meant fighter or survivor. At 2 a.m. her phone rang. It was Dr. Priest. Grace, I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to see you immediately. Can you come to the hospital? What's wrong? Is Noah okay? Noah is fine, but there's something I need to show you. Something I should have caught weeks ago. Young Grace was in her car within minutes, speeding through empty streets to Boston General. Dr. Priest met her in the parking garage, looking haunted. I've been reviewing your surgical records, he said without preamble. The original ones, from my personal files. Grace, you gave birth to twins. I delivered both babies myself. I know. Thomas Barrett told me everything. Dr. Priest blinked. You know for how long? A few hours. Dr. Priest, do you have any proof, any evidence that can't be explained away? He held up a manila envelope. Footprints. We take footprints of every baby's born in this hospital. I printed both of your son's feet immediately after delivery. I keep copies in my personal files, separate from the hospital database. He handed her the envelope. Inside were 2 cards, each with a tiny set of footprints in ink. Baby A. Hartford, 3 pounds, 2 ounces. Time of birth, 11:42 p.m. Baby B. Hartford, 2 pounds, 9 ounces. Time of birth, 11:53 p.m. Grace traced the small prints with her finger, tears blurring her vision. These are my sons. Yes, and Grace, there's something else. I had the lab run a comparison with the DNA sample from Vivian's baby, the one that Blake's lawyer submitted for the paternity test. And it's a match. Vivian's baby is your baby B, your missing twin. Grace closed her eyes. She had known it intellectually, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that shattered her all over again. I'm going to get him back, she said. I'm going to get both of my sons back, and I'm going to make sure Blake and Vivian never hurt anyone again. Dr. Priest squeezed her shoulder. I'll testify to all of it, the altered records, the stolen baby, everything. I'm with you, Grace. She looked at this man who barely knew her, who had no reason to risk his career for her sake. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because I took an oath to do no harm. And what happened to you, what they did to your children, that's harm. That's evil. And I won't stand by and let it continue. Grace hugged him, this stranger who had become her ally. And for the first time in weeks, she felt something like hope. They were going to win this. They had to. Grace had promised Diane she would wait, that she would be patient, let the evidence build. Let Blake and Vivian believe they had won. But at 3 a.m., sitting in her car outside Blake's penthouse, all she could think about was her baby, the son she had never held, the twin who had been stolen from her before she even knew he existed. She couldn't wait. The doorman recognized her. Mrs. Hartford, Mr. Hartford said, I'm still his wife, Grace said firmly. Until the divorce is final, I have every right to be here. It was a lie. The restraining order said she couldn't come within 500 feet of Blake, but the doorman didn't know that, and he let her through. The elevator ride to the penthouse felt like descending into a nightmare. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She didn't have a plan. She just knew she needed to see her baby. She used her old key code. Miraculously, it still worked. The door clicked open, and Grace stepped into the home she had once shared with Blake. Everything was the same. The furniture, the art on the walls, the smell of expensive coffee, but it felt foreign now, like a museum of someone else's life. She heard a baby crying upstairs. Grace moved on instinct, taking the stairs two at a time. The nursery door was ajar, light spilling into the hallway. Inside, Vivian stood over a crib, rocking a baby in her arms. Shh, Alexander, it's okay. Mommy's here. Grace's vision went red. That's not his name. Vivian spun around, her eyes going wide. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Sisters who looked so alike, who had once shared everything, now separated by a chasm of betrayal so deep it could never be crossed. Grace, Vivian said carefully, you shouldn't be here. You stole my baby. Grace's voice was shaking. You stole my son, and you've been raising him as yours. I don't know what you're talking about. Or didn't lie to me. Grace moved forward, and Vivian clutched the baby tighter. I know everything. Vivian, Thomas told me about the DNA samples. Dr. Priest showed me the footprints. I have the hospital security footage of you wheeling my baby out of the NICU. Vivian's expression flickered. Fear, then calculation, then something hard and cold. Fine, she said. You want the truth? Yes, I took him. And you know what? He's better off with me. How can you say that? Because you're weak, Grace. You always have been. Perfect grades, perfect marriage, perfect life. And you never had to fight for any of it. Everything was just handed to you. So you decided to take it all away. I decided to take what should have been mine. Vivian's voice rose, and the baby started crying harder. Do you know what it was like growing up in your shadow every time I accomplished something? Mom and Dad compared it to you. Every boyfriend I had asked me why I wasn't more like you. Even Blake. He met me first. Did you know that at a charity event, 2 years before he met you, he flirted with me, got my number, and then you showed up, and suddenly I didn't exist. He only had eyes for you. Grace's mind reeled. That's not true. Blake never mentioned you. Because to him, I was nothing. Just the forgettable little sister. But I knew, Grace. I knew he was mine first. So when I had the chance to take him back, I did. By destroying me, by stealing my children. Vivian smiled, and it was chilling. You make it sound so dramatic. I just took what I deserved. Blake loves me now. We're building a life together. And your precious babies. They're going to call me Mom. They're going to forget you ever existed. Something in Grace snapped. She lunged forward, reaching for the baby, and Vivian stumbled backward. They collided, the baby screaming between them. Vivian's heel caught on the edge of the rug, and she lost her balance. Everything happened in slow motion. Vivian fell backward, the baby slipping from her arms. Grace dove forward, catching her son before he could hit the floor. She rolled, cradling him against her chest, feeling his small body warm and alive in her arms. Behind her, Vivian screamed. Grace turned to see her sister at the top of the stairs, arms windmilling, trying to catch her balance. Their eyes met for one suspended moment. Then Vivian fell. She tumbled down the marble staircase, her body hitting each step with sickening thuds. Grace watched in horror, frozen at the top landing, her baby clutched against her chest. Vivian came to rest at the bottom of the stairs, her body twisted at an unnatural angle, blood pooling beneath her head. Grace started down the stairs, but the front door burst open and Blake rushed in. He saw Vivian's body, then looked up at Grace holding the baby. "What did you do?" His voice was raw with shock. "She fell. Blake, it was an accident. But he wasn't listening. He was pulling out his phone, calling 911, his hands shaking. "This is Blake Hartford at 1 Charles Street. My wife has been attacked. Send an ambulance and police immediately." "Blake, no, please listen. You need to put down the baby." "Grace." His voice was cold now, back under control. "Put him down and step away." "He's mine, Blake. This is our son. He's Noah's twin. Vivian stole him from the hospital." "You're delusional. You broke into my home. You attacked Vivian, and now you're trying to kidnap my child." The sound of sirens filled the air. Grace looked down into the baby in her arms. He had stopped crying and was looking at her with dark eyes. Blake's eyes. Her son. "I'm sorry, Daw," she whispered to him. "I'm so. Then she gently placed him in his crib and raised her hands as police officers stormed through the door. "Grace Hartford, you are under arrest for assault, breaking and entering, and attempted kidnapping." They cuffed her hands behind her back, read her rights, led her past Vivian's body, past Blake's accusing stare, past the life she had fought so hard to reclaim. And as they pushed her into the back of a police car, Grace realized with terrible clarity that everything had just gotten so much worse. The Suffolk County Courthouse was packed. Grace's trial had become a media sensation. The wronged wife turned violent stalker, the sympathetic CEO and his injured girlfriend, the dramatic fall and the stolen baby accusations. It was everything the 24-hour news cycle craved. Grace sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She had been denied bail, deemed a flight risk and a danger to others. She had spent 6 weeks in jail, separated from Noah, unable to hold her sons or fight for custody. 6 weeks during which Vivian had recovered in a private hospital room, playing the victim for every camera that would listen. Her public defender, Margaret Foster, looked even more exhausted than during the custody hearing. She shuffled papers, made notes, but Grace could tell she thought this was a lost cause. Across the aisle, Blake sat with his legal team. Vivian was beside him in a wheelchair, neck brace visible, looking pale and fragile. The bruises on her face had faded, but the performance was perfect. The prosecutor stood for his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is a simple case. Grace Hartford, unable to accept her husband's decision to leave her, became obsessed with destroying his new life. She broke into his home in the middle of the night, confronted his fiancée while she was alone with an infant, and when Vivian tried to protect the child, Mrs. Hartford pushed her down a flight of stairs. Vivian Hartford suffered a fractured skull, 3 broken ribs, and a spinal injury that may leave her with permanent nerve damage." The jury looked at Grace with disgust. She wanted to scream that none of it was true, but she stayed silent. "The prosecution will prove that Mrs. Hartford is dangerous, unstable, and guilty of assault with intent to cause serious bodily harm. We will show that her claims about stolen babies and conspiracies are the delusions of a woman who has lost touch with reality, and we will ask you to hold her accountable for her violence." Margaret Foster's opening statement was weaker, more apologetic. "Mrs. Hartford is a mother who was trying to protect her child. The circumstances of that night are more complicated than the prosecution suggests. We will present evidence that raises questions about who is really telling the truth." But she didn't sound convinced, and the jury could hear it. The prosecution called witness after witness: the police officers who arrested Grace, the paramedics who treated Vivian, a psychiatrist who testified about Grace's obsessive delusions. Blake took the stand, his testimony calm and measured. "I loved Grace once," he said, looking directly at the jury. "I tried to end our marriage with dignity, to provide for her financially, but she couldn't accept it. She started showing up at my office, sending threatening messages, making wild accusations. I was forced to get a restraining order for Vivian's safety. And then the night of the attack, Grace broke into our home. She grabbed our baby from Vivian's arms, and when Vivian tried to stop her, Grace shoved her down the stairs. I heard Vivian scream. I came home to find my fiancée bleeding on the floor and Grace standing over her with our child. It was a masterful performance. Even the reporters were wiping their eyes. Then Vivian testified. She wheeled herself to the stand, her voice soft and broken. Grace is my sister. I love her. I always have. When she and Blake grew apart, I tried to support her, but then Blake and I fell in love. I know it was complicated, but we couldn't help our feelings. I thought Grace understood." Vivian's voice cracked. "I never imagined she would hurt me. When she came into the nursery that night, I thought she just wanted to talk. But she grabbed Alexander, and when I tried to take him back, she pushed me. I remember falling, and then nothing." Grace's hands clenched under the table. Every word was a lie, but Vivian delivered them so perfectly. The prosecution rested their case. Margaret Foster called Dr. Priest to the stand. He was their only hope. "Dr. Priest, you delivered Grace Hartford's baby." "I delivered her babies, yes, twins." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Vivian went pale. "Can you explain?" Owen pulled out the footprint cards. "These are the hospital records from the night of delivery. 2 infants, both male. Baby A weighed 3 pounds 2 ounces. Baby B weighed 2 pounds 9 ounces. Both were born alive. I personally printed their feet." The prosecutor objected. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The official hospital records show only one birth." "The official records were altered," Owen said firmly. "I kept my own copies because I suspected something was wrong, and I have security footage showing Vivian Hartford entering the NICU and removing baby B 3 hours after delivery." The courtroom erupted. Judge Winters called for order, slamming her gavel repeatedly. Blake's face had gone ashen. He turned to look at Vivian, who was shaking her head frantically. "That's a lie," Vivian said. "Dr. Priest is confused. There was only one baby. I gave birth to Alexander 2 weeks later at a private facility." "Then you won't mind a DNA test," Margaret Foster said, "to prove the baby you're raising is yours and not Grace's." The prosecutor stood. "Your Honor, this is a circus. The defense is making desperate accusations." "I agree with the defense," Judge Winters interrupted. "If there are questions about the child's parentage, we need answers. I'm ordering an immediate DNA test of both Grace Hartford's son and the infant known as Alexander Hartford. Results to be submitted within 48 hours. Court is adjourned until then." Grace felt something like hope for the first time in weeks. But as the bailiff led her back to holding, she saw Vivian and Blake in the hallway. They were arguing, their voices low and urgent. Blake looked furious. Vivian looked terrified. And Grace realized that the truth was about to come out. Whether Vivian was ready or not, the DNA results came back in 36 hours. Grace was brought back to the courtroom in handcuffs, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. Judge Winters held the sealed envelope, her expression unreadable. "Before I open these results, does anyone have anything they'd like to say?" Blake's lead attorney stood. "Your Honor, my client would like to request a recess to consult with his legal team." "Denied. Sit down." The lawyer sat. Judge Winters opened the envelope and read the contents. Her eyebrows rose. She read it again, then looked at Vivian with something like disgust. "Miss Callahan, would you like to change your testimony?" Vivian's hands gripped the wheelchair arms. I don't know what you mean." "Then let me be clear. According to these DNA results, the infant you've been raising as Alexander Hartford is not your biological child. He is, however, a genetic match to both Blake Hartford and Grace Hartford. Furthermore, he is a twin to the infant known as Noah Hartford." Judge Winters leaned forward. "You stole a baby from a hospital NICU and passed him off as your own. Is that correct?" The courtroom exploded. Reporters shouted questions. Blake jumped to his feet. staring at Vivian in horror. The jury looked stunned. Vivian's face crumpled. No, no, you don't understand. I did it for Blake. He wanted a son. He wanted a family. Grace didn't deserve them. Be quiet, Blake said, his voice like ice. Don't say another word. But Vivian couldn't stop. The mask had shattered, and everything beneath came pouring out. I gave him everything. I made myself perfect for him. I stole Grace's money. I took her baby. I ruined her reputation. All so he could have the life he deserved without her dragging him down. And he was happy. We were happy. Blake backed away from her. You told me you were pregnant. You showed me ultrasounds. His voice broke. You lied about everything. I did it for you, Vivian screamed. I did it all for you. Oh, Judge Winters slammed her gavel. Order Miss Callahan. You are under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, perjury, and conspiracy. Bailiff, take her into custody. Two officers approached Vivian's wheelchair. She fought them, screaming Grace's name over and over, her voice echoing through the courthouse. This is your fault. Grace, you had everything and you threw it away. I was just taking what you didn't want. They dragged her from the courtroom, still screaming. Blake stood frozen, his perfect world collapsing around him. His lawyers were already gathering their files, preparing to distance themselves from the scandal. Judge Winters turned to Grace. Mrs. Hartford, in light of this evidence, all charges against you are dismissed. You are free to go. Full custody of both children is immediately restored to you, pending a formal hearing. Mr. Hartford, you are under investigation for financial fraud and conspiracy. If you attempt to leave the state, you will be arrested. Grace couldn't move, couldn't speak. After months of fighting, of being called crazy and unstable and dangerous, she had won. Margaret Foster helped her stand. It's over, Grace. You can go home. But as Grace left the courtroom, she saw Blake sitting alone on a bench in the hallway, his head in his hands. He looked up as she passed, and for the first time, she saw something like remorse in his eyes. Grace, I didn't know about the baby, the money, any of it. Vivian told me you had an affair, that Noah might not be mine. I thought, his voice broke. I thought I was protecting myself, but I just destroyed everything. Grace should have felt satisfaction, should have wanted him to suffer the way she had suffered. Instead, she just felt tired. You chose to believe her, Grace said quietly. You chose to freeze my accounts, change the locks, take my son. You humiliated me at that gala in front of everyone. Maybe you didn't know about Vivian's lies, Blake, but you made your own choices, and you'll have to live with them. She walked away, and this time she didn't look back. Outside the courthouse, Diane Fletcher was waiting with her camera crew. She pulled Grace into a hug. We got them, Diane whispered. We got them both. What happens now? Grace asked. Now you rebuild. You take care of your sons. You testify against Vivian and Blake if you're willing, and you move forward. Grace thought about her babies, both of them waiting for her at the hospital. Noah, who she had held every day, and his twin brother, who she still hadn't named, who she had touched for only a few minutes before the police took her away. I want to see my sons, she said. Let's go get them. At Boston General, Dr. Priest was waiting with both babies. They were in side-by-side bassinets, awake and alert, tiny fists waving in the air. They're healthy, Owen said with a smile. Both of them, strong and healthy and ready to go home. Grace looked down at her sons, Noah, who she knew so well, and his brother, who was a stranger to her. She picked him up carefully, feeling his weight, his warmth, his small heart beating against her chest. Hi, baby, she whispered. I'm your mom. I'm so sorry it took me so long to find you. The baby made a small sound, and Grace started to cry. What are you going to name him? Owen asked gently. Grace thought about everything they had survived. The lies, the theft, the betrayal, the fight to uncover the truth and reclaim their family. Miles, she said. His name is Miles because we've traveled so far to get here. She held Miles in one arm and Noah in the other. Her twin sons finally together, finally safe. And for the first time in months, Grace Hartford could breathe. 8 months later, Grace sat in the same courtroom where she had been tried and acquitted. But this time, she wasn't the defendant. She was the victim, come to see justice finally served. Vivian's trial had been swift, with a mountain of evidence against her: kidnapping, fraud, identity theft, perjury, conspiracy. Her lawyers had advised her to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. She had refused. Vivian insisted on taking her case to trial, convinced she could make a jury understand. She testified for 3 days, explaining how she had been overshadowed by Grace her entire life, how Blake had loved her first, how she had only taken what should have been hers. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Guilty on all counts. Now, Judge Winters prepared to hand down the sentence. Vivian sat at the defense table, thinner than Grace had ever seen her hair pulled back severely, wearing a plain gray suit. She looked small, diminished. Nothing like the glamorous woman who had smiled on Blake's arm at that gala so many months ago. "Miss Callahan," Judge Winters said, her voice hard, "I have presided over many cases in my 30 years on the bench, but I have rarely seen such calculated cruelty. You didn't just steal a child. You orchestrated an elaborate conspiracy to destroy your own sister. You forged documents, bribed hospital staff, manipulated DNA evidence, and committed perjury in this courtroom. You showed no remorse, no understanding of the harm you caused." Vivian stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. "For the crime of kidnapping, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. For fraud and conspiracy, an additional 8 years, to run consecutively. You will serve a minimum of 20 years before you are eligible for parole. And you are hereby ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $39 million to Grace Hartford, representing the funds you stole from her trust." 23 years. Grace felt the number settle over her like a weight. Vivian would be nearly 50 when she got out. If she got out, the bailiff moved to take Vivian back into custody. But she turned one last time to look at Grace. "I hope you're happy," Vivian said, her voice hollow. "I hope it was worth it." Grace met her sister's eyes. "Goodbye, Vivian." And she meant it. She was letting Vivian take up space in her heart, in her mind, in her life. Blake's sentencing was scheduled for the following week. The FBI had uncovered years of financial fraud at Hartford Technologies: insider trading, embezzlement, falsified earnings reports. The company had collapsed, the stock worthless, hundreds of employees out of work. Blake had tried to flee to the Cayman Islands but was arrested at Logan Airport. He pleaded guilty to avoid trial, hoping for leniency. He didn't get it. Judge Winters sentenced him to 12 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $85 million in restitution to defrauded investors. His assets were seized: his penthouse, his cars, his art collection, everything sold at auction. The man who had once been worth hundreds of millions would leave prison with nothing. Grace attended his sentencing too, though she sat in the back, holding both her sons. They were 8 months old now, healthy and happy, with Blake's dark eyes and Grace's smile. Blake saw them as he was led from the courtroom. He stopped, just for a moment, staring at the children he would never know. "Can I?" he started to say, but the guards pulled him forward. Grace didn't stop them. After both sentencings, Diane Fletcher published her expose. It ran on the front page of the Boston Globe and was picked up by national media. The stolen twins: how one woman fought back against her sister's conspiracy. The article detailed everything: the fake pregnancy, the hospital theft, the forged signatures, the DNA manipulation. It exposed Blake's fraud and Vivian's obsession. It told Grace's story of survival, and it sparked a national conversation about custody battles, about how easily powerful men could manipulate the legal system, about how women's voices were dismissed as hysterical or unstable. Grace received hundreds of messages from women who had been through similar ordeals: mothers who had lost custody because they couldn't afford good lawyers, women whose abusive ex-husbands had turned the system against them, sisters who had been betrayed by people they trusted. She read every message, and she started to formulate a plan. 6 months after Vivian's sentencing, Grace stood before a small crowd in a community center in Dorchester. Behind her was a banner that read, "The Hartford Project, Justice for Mothers." "I started this foundation," Grace said, her voice steady, Because I learned something important through everything I went through. Money and power shouldn't determine who gets to keep their children. Truth should matter more than legal maneuvering. And mothers shouldn't have to fight alone. The Hartford Project offered free legal services to mothers in custody battles. It funded investigations into false allegations. It lobbied for reforms in family court procedures. And it provided support groups where women could share their stories without judgment. Grace used the $39 million Vivian had been ordered to pay in restitution. The funds would likely never materialize, but Grace had recovered most of her original trust to fund the foundation. She hired Ruby Sinclair as their lead attorney. Diane Fletcher served on the board of directors, and Dr. Owen Priest ran their medical advisory committee, helping other doctors recognize the signs of falsified records in stolen infants. The foundation grew quickly. Within a year, they had helped 73 mothers win custody cases. They had exposed 12 instances of evidence tampering. They had gotten 3 corrupt lawyers disbarred. Grace threw herself into the work, not to forget what had happened. She would never forget, but to transform her pain into something useful. She still had nightmares sometimes. She would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that Miles had been taken again, that Vivian had somehow escaped prison and come back to finish what she started. But then she would walk down the hall to the twins' room and find them sleeping peacefully in their cribs, safe and whole in hers. On their first birthday, Grace threw a party, just a small gathering, close friends and allies who had helped her through the darkest time of her life. Diane was there with her family. Dr. Owen brought his daughter. Margaret Foster came with her wife. Thomas Barrett, who had testified against both Blake and Vivian, brought a gift. Grace watched Noah and Miles smash their birthday cakes, frosting everywhere, laughing with pure joy. They didn't know yet what they had survived, what they had lost and found and lost again. But someday when they were old enough, she would tell them. She would tell them about their father, who had been brilliant and charming and weak, about their aunt, who had been sick in ways that destroyed everyone around her, about the system that had failed to protect them, and the people who had fought to make it right. And she would tell them that they were stronger than any of it. As the party wound down and guests started to leave, Owen Priest lingered. He had become a constant presence in Grace's life over the past year. Not romantic, not exactly, but something solid and steady. "You did good today," he said, watching the twins play. "They're resilient," Grace replied. "I just hope I'm raising them right." "You are," Owen smiled. "And Grace, whenever you're ready, I'd like to take you to dinner. A real date, not just coffee while planning legal strategy." Grace looked at him, this man who had saved her life and her son's lives, who had risked his career to tell the truth. "I'd like that," she said. "Soon, I promise. But not yet." She still had work to do, healing that couldn't be rushed, a foundation that needed her attention, and 2 little boys who needed their mother to be whole before she could share her heart with anyone else. That night, after everyone had gone home and the twins were asleep, Grace sat on the floor of their nursery. She pulled out a box she kept in the closet, filled with things from before, photos from her wedding, ultrasound pictures, a program from that terrible gala where everything had fallen apart. She looked at them one by one, saying goodbye to the woman she had been, the naive girl who had thought love and family were simple, that marriage vows meant something, that blood ties guaranteed loyalty. That woman was gone, and in her place was someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more capable. Grace Hartford had survived, and now she was going to make sure other mothers survived too. 2 years after the trial, Grace stood at the podium in the Massachusetts State House, preparing to testify before a legislative committee. Her foundation had drafted new regulations for custody proceedings, and today she would argue for their adoption. The twins were with Owen Priest, who had become a steady presence in their lives. More than a friend, but less than a stepfather. Grace wasn't ready for labels yet, and Owen never pushed. "Committee members," Grace began, her voice clear and strong. "I'm here today to talk about how our family court system fails mothers, about how easily false allegations can destroy lives, about how money and legal manipulation can trump truth and justice." She told an abbreviated version of her story, not for sympathy, but to illustrate the systemic failures that had nearly cost her everything. "My case had a rare happy ending because I had allies. a doctor who kept personal records, a journalist who believed me, an accountant who risked everything to testify. But most mothers don't have those resources. Most mothers fight alone, and most mothers lose. She presented their proposed reforms: mandatory preservation of original medical records, stricter penalties for evidence tampering, free legal representation in custody cases involving domestic abuse or fraud allegations, better training for judges on recognizing parental alienation and false accusations. The committee members asked questions. Some were skeptical. Others were moved. By the end of her testimony, 3 had pledged their support. It wasn't everything, but it was progress. After the hearing, Grace drove to Noah and Miles' preschool. They were 3 now, full of energy and questions and personality. Noah was quiet and thoughtful, content to play alone with his toy cars. Miles was loud and affectionate, always climbing into laps, always asking why. They looked so much like Blake. The same dark hair, the same serious eyes. Grace wondered sometimes if that would bother her, if she would see their father in them and feel anger or pain. But she didn't. She saw them, her boys, perfect and whole and entirely their own people. "Mama," Miles ran to her, arms outstretched. Noah followed more slowly, clutching a drawing he had made. "Look what I made," Noah said, handing her a paper covered in crayon scribbles. Grace could just make out 2 figures holding hands. "Tell me about it, sweetheart." "That's me and Miles. We're brothers, forever and ever." Grace's throat tightened. "Forever and ever," she agreed. That evening, they had dinner with Owen at his house. He cooked pasta while the twins played in the yard with his golden retriever. It felt comfortable, domestic, like a family. "I got a letter today," Owen said as they cleaned up. "From Blake." Grace's hands stilled in the dishwater. "What did it say?" He asked if there was any way he could see the boys. "Just photos, maybe, or letters. He said he doesn't expect forgiveness, but he wants them to know he exists." Grace dried her hands slowly. She had known this request would come eventually. Blake was serving his sentence at a minimum security federal prison in Pennsylvania. He would be eligible for parole in 8 years. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. Owen considered. "I think that's entirely up to you. He's their biological father, but he gave up any right to them when he chose Vivian over Truth. You don't owe him anything." "Grace? But do they deserve to know him someday? Maybe, when they're older? When they can understand what happened and make their own choices." Owen touched her shoulder gently. "But not now. Not while they're too young to understand why he wasn't there." Grace nodded. It was the answer she had been circling toward herself. She wrote back to Blake that night, a brief letter explaining that the boys were too young for this conversation. That someday, when they were old enough, she would tell them about their father, both the good and the bad, and if they wanted a relationship with him then, she wouldn't stand in their way. But for now, he needed to let them be children, safe and loved and free from adult complications. She never received a response. Maybe Blake understood. Maybe he was angry. Grace found she didn't particularly care. She had spent too much energy on Blake and Vivian already, on their choices, their betrayals, their consequences. Now it was time to focus on her own life. The Hartford Project continued to grow. They opened a second office in Worcester, then a third in Springfield. They helped hundreds of mothers. Some cases they won, others they lost. But every woman who walked through their doors left knowing she had fought as hard as she could. With the best representation available, Grace became a voice for family court reform. She testified in other states, shared her story at conferences, wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times. People started recognizing her, which felt strange but also meaningful. She was using her platform for something that mattered. On what would have been her 10th wedding anniversary to Blake, Grace went to the beach in Maine where he had proposed. She brought the twins, now 4 years old, and let them run wild on the sand. She thought about that younger version of herself, the woman who had said yes to Blake's proposal without hesitation, who had believed in forever and happy endings and love conquering all. She didn't regret becoming that woman. Even knowing how it would end, she wouldn't change those early years, because they had led her here, to these 2 perfect boys, building sandcastles and chasing waves. "Mama, look," Miles shouted, holding up a shell. It's beautiful, baby. Can we come back tomorrow? Maybe not tomorrow, but we'll come back. This is a special place. That night, after the twins were asleep, Grace sat on her porch with a cup of tea. Owen had gone home, but they had plans for dinner later that week. Maybe they would become something more eventually. Or maybe they would remain friends and co-parents of sorts. Grace was learning to be okay with uncertainty, with taking things slowly, with protecting the peace she had fought so hard to build. Her phone buzzed with a message from Diane. Just heard Vivian was denied parole. She'll serve the full sentence. Grace read it twice, waiting to feel something. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. Instead, she just felt sad. Sad for the sister she had loved once, before jealousy and mental illness had twisted her into someone unrecognizable. Sad for the family that had been broken beyond repair, but also grateful. Grateful that her sons would grow up knowing their mother had fought for them. That truth mattered more than money. That justice, however delayed, was possible. She had lost so much: her marriage, her trust fund, years of peace of mind, a sister she could never get back. But she had gained something too, strength she didn't know she possessed, a purpose larger than herself, and the certain knowledge that she could survive anything. Grace Hartford had been betrayed, humiliated, stolen from, and nearly destroyed. And she had risen anyway. 5 years after the trial, Grace was invited to speak at a national conference on family law reform. The twins were starting first grade, happy and well-adjusted, despite everything they had been through. She took the stage in front of 500 lawyers, judges, and advocates, and told her story one more time. "I'm often asked if I've forgiven Blake and Vivian," she said near the end. "The answer is complicated. I've forgiven them enough to move forward with my life. I don't carry rage anymore. It was too heavy, and it wasn't serving me or my children." She paused, looking out at the audience. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean excusing. And it doesn't mean I won't spend the rest of my life fighting to make sure other mothers don't suffer the way I did. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Afterward, dozens of women approached her. Some shared their stories. Others just wanted to shake her hand, to thank her for speaking up. One woman, young and pregnant and terrified, whispered, "My husband is threatening to take my baby. He says I'm unfit. He has lawyers and money and I have nothing." Grace took her hands. "You have me. Come to our office on Monday. We'll help you." Because that's what Grace Hartford did now. She helped. She fought. She bore witness to other women's pain and transformed it into action. And every night she went home to her sons, who knew nothing of trust funds or stolen identities or legal battles, who only knew that their mother loved them fiercely and completely, who only knew they were safe. As Grace tucked Noah and Miles into bed that night, Miles asked a question he had never asked before. "Mama, do I have a daddy?" Grace's heart clenched. She had known this conversation would come eventually. "You do, sweetheart. His name is Blake." "Where is he?" "He's far away right now. He made some mistakes, and he's working on being a better person." "Does he love us?" Grace chose her words carefully. "I think he does, in his own way. But loving someone and being there for them are different things. And right now, he can't be here." "That's okay," Noah said quietly. "We have you. And Dr. Owen," Miles added. Grace smiled through her tears. "Yes, you have me, and you have Dr. Owen, and you have so many people who love you." "We're lucky," Noah decided, and looking at her boys, safe and whole and completely unaware of how close they had come to a different life, Grace had to agree. They were lucky. Not because everything had worked out perfectly, but because they had survived. Because truth had won over lies. Because love, the real kind, the fierce protective kind, had been enough. As Grace turned off the light and closed their door, she thought about the woman she had been that night at the gala. Pregnant and naive, believing her husband's love was unconditional. If she could go back and tell that woman one thing, it would be this: you are stronger than you know. The worst thing you can imagine is about to happen, and you will survive it. You will rise from the ashes of your old life and build something better. You will lose everything and still have enough. Because in the end, Grace Hartford had learned the most important lesson of all. She didn't need Blake or Vivian or anyone else to validate her worth. She was enough on her own, and that knowledge, hard-won and blood-bought, was the greatest gift she could pass on to her sons. Grace's journey wasn't just about revenge or justice. It was about refusing to let other people's choices define her story. Every day, women face custody battles built on lies. Every day, mothers lose their children to systems that favor money over truth. If you or someone you know is fighting for their children, you're not alone. Organizations like the Hartford Project exist to help. Free legal aid, support groups, advocacy. It's out there. It's why you don't have to face this fight alone. Remember, the obstacle is the way. Your pain can become your purpose. And survival is just the beginning of your story. If this story moved you, share it. Subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and the unbreakable strength of mothers who refuse to give up. Because Grace Hartford's story is real. Maybe not in the specific details, but in the spirit of every woman who has had to fight for what's rightfully hers. And every one of them deserves to win.